a very, very special episode of House to Home. We're so excited because we're actually going live for the first ever time on this show. So, House to Home is a show brought to you by Family Policy Alliance Foundation. My name is Grace Youngson, and as always, I'm alongside my co host, Joseph Combe. And we're going to be dealing with a crazy topic today. To help you think about this, I want you to imagine that your daughter is struggling with her gender identity. Maybe she thinks that she's a boy. So, as a parent, you're trying to seek out help for her. You want to take her to a counselor, to a therapist, so that she can talk this through, what she's going through. And when you do so, you find that there's only one option for her, and that is to be counseled or pushed along the path of being a boy, as she thinks that she may be. She is not allowed to be counseled in her thoughts of actually being a girl, the way that God created her. And maybe she's uncomfortable with that, and there are things that she wants to talk through, but, she is still a girl. Isn't that a crazy thought? Well, the Supreme Court just heard a case about this very thing. Joseph, could you enlighten us on this?
Yes, I'd love to, Grace. It's great to be on here with you on, like you said, our first time going live with House to Home. And we think that's appropriate today to cover this case. I mean, the hypothetical you just laid out, Grace, is exactly what's in question here, where parents and patients cannot get the help they need for kids who are uncomfortable with who God made them and want to get comfortable with their biological sex. So yesterday's case that the court heard oral arguments for at the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm coming live from down the street, actually, from our great friends at CPI. They heard the case called Childs versus Salazar. So who are those people? Just briefly, Kaylee Childs is a counselor in Colorado, and she's a heroic, courageous woman who many of us admire. And there are many counselors like her who live in states with laws like Colorado. And what those laws say is that mental health counselors can only counsel children struggling with who God made them as a man or a woman. They can only counsel them to transition to the opposite sex or try to. They cannot counsel them to help them become comfortable in the sex that God made them, even if that's what they want as patients. This is called an anti-conversion therapy law, which in itself is a misnomer. We'll talk about that. And we actually have talked about it at length already in a previous House to Home episode. Our regular listeners will remember our episode with our great friend Elizabeth Woning from Changed Movement, where we talked about all that is and isn't conversion therapy and how these laws actually prevent patients who need help from getting the help they need. For our audience, if you haven't listened to that episode, I would encourage you, please go back and listen to it and follow Elizabeth and Changed Movement on social media because they are the best voices on this topic. And part of what Elizabeth and I talked about was the examples of when patients can't get the help they need because of these laws. This is one of those cases. So Kaylee Childs represents essentially all of the mental health profession that has to live under these laws and is effectively being muzzled by these state laws. It's denying them their First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So she's the first party, the petitioner in this case, versus Patty Salazar, which is her capacity as executive director of Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. That really just means the state of Colorado, who would be enforcing this law that muzzles counselors. So she sued to challenge this law because she wants to be able to practice her profession as a health counselor the way she thinks is right. And if a child wants her to help them come to terms with who he or she is as their biological sex, she can't do that under this law. So Kaylee Childs is a courageous woman. She's represented by our great friends at the Alliance Defending Freedom. Jim Campbell, their senior legal counsel, argued the case on her behalf yesterday. We'll talk a little bit about what he did say during that argument. But Grace, if it's all right with you, I'd like to just say what's at stake in this case, because we at FPA have a lot caught up in this, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. We have a lot of different things. Absolutely, I think you should outline those.
Yeah. So first and foremost is our listeners will most be familiar with our Help Not Harm campaign, which for listeners who haven't heard of that before, this is our policy campaign, which you'd see on the front page of our website to protect children from gender ideology, primarily by protecting them from gender transition procedures, which in this case means puberty blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, and then actual sex change procedures. But before a patient ever gets to the point where they're really seriously considering gender transition procedures, they almost always have to see a mental health care professional who then directs them down that transition pipeline and refers them there. Kaylee Childs represents all the mental health care professionals who do not want to participate in that therapist's office, the plastic surgeon, barbaric pipeline that many of these poor kids have been put into. And so that's why this case and the right of mental health care professionals to practice their craft the way they see fit is absolutely critical to achieving our help not harm vision to protect kids from gender ideology. So there's also obviously a lot of religious freedom caught up in this case. Um, Mental health care professionals who are people of faith know, we know as part of our faith, God made each person male or female. There is no way to transition. And mental health care professionals should be able to practice their craft in accordance with their faith. This is also about a lot of healthcare autonomy. First, for the mental health care practitioners, they need to be able to practice their faith or practice their craft according to what they see as best. But also for the patients, because the law prevents counselors from counseling these child patients in one direction, and there's no choice. There's only one way to go. The state is picking the winner and the loser here, and that takes the healthcare decision for the outcome of the counseling away from the patient, which we think is quite dangerous. We might talk a little bit more about that later. And similarly, patient access to care for kids who are struggling with these feelings of discomfort in who God made them. They need to be able to access the care that they want, and these laws prevent that. And here I do want to give a shout out to Renee Carlson and True North Legal, which is the legal office of Minnesota Family Council, or the Minnesota State Family Policy Council. There are 39 of those across the country. Our listeners have heard us talk about these. They're all listed on FPA's website under the Allies tab. Renee and her team at True North Legal have filed an amicus brief in this case, and the amicus brief, in part, leaned heavily on the testimonies of two mental health counselors, our friends Aaron Brewer and Nate Oilo, who I had the privilege to meet and who we're hoping to have on this show in the next several months. But they filed an amicus brief on behalf of those counselors who indeed have their own testimonies of how important it was for them to be able to access this care. And we just don't think the government should be choosing these healthcare outcomes. So a lot at stake here, huh, Grace?
Yeah, there is a lot. I think you outlined all of that really well. And I mean, I would love to touch back on the help not harm side of this, because this case, if it was ruled in a way that we do not want it to be ruled, would basically say that kids have no choice but to go down a path of making life altering decisions at a young age, not being allowed. Wouldn't it be common sense to help them be comfortable in who they are and not be like, okay, let's do a life altering surgery right here. You're 10 years old. You don't even know what you want for your life. I mean, even me, I'm 24, and does everyone have their life figured out in their 20s? No. Like, I wouldn't want to make a life altering decision like that. And I think that when you think about it from the patient's point of view, this is what medical care should be about, right? It's about the patient. It's about caring for the patient. You think about the Hippocrates oath, it's about taking care of the patient above all else. And to be only offering one option, which is the far crazier, more dangerous, more life altering option, where there is no way of going back on some of those decisions once you've had certain surgeries or taken certain hormones, I think is the least caring thing possible. And so it's crazy that this is even being debated, but obviously, good thing that we have some strong legal defense from our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom. And
Mhm.
I think that this is why we wanted to go live. It's so important that we are talking about this, because this affects the future. One day when I'm a mother, if my child came to me and was struggling with this, I want to be able to take them to a professional who can help them be comfortable in who God made them to be, and not push them down a path that I know is going to hurt them. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
thanks for
well said.
outlining that for us.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I mean, it's crazy. Like you said, it's crazy that we're debating this. It's crazy that 22 plus states have enacted a law like this. I mean, for kids to get the help that we know they need, we have to protect them from this harm and enable the mental health care professionals to provide that for them. So it's this shouldn't. You're right, Grace. This shouldn't be debated, but here we are, and this is one of the things. I'll lead us into just recapping briefly the oral arguments here with this. like you said, this is the state choosing healthcare outcomes, which is frankly quite snobby of a state to do. Just imagine the government saying, "We know you better than you know you, and we know what you need better than you do. So we're going to force that at law, and we're going to force every mental health care professional to be complicit in that." And believe it or not, I want our audience to know that was a cornerstone of the state of Colorado's argument yesterday in the court. I was listening to it live thinking, I know this is what the states that have passed these laws believe, but I'm really quite surprised that the Solicitor General of Colorado leaned quite so heavily on this. So, with that, I do just want to take us briefly through the oral arguments, and we'll reflect on a few key points from it. We'll talk more about this specific topic in a second. So, if people are not familiar with the Supreme Court, and I wouldn't blame anyone for that, when oral arguments happen, the petitioners, that's Kayla Childs' party, goes first, followed by the respondents, which in this case is the state of Colorado being represented by the Colorado Solicitor General, Shannon Stevens. And then the petitioners always get a very brief rebuttal at the very end. And when the first lawyer goes up to make their case, the justices, after just a minute, usually start peppering them with questions. And they do this in order of seniority, sort of emceed by the Chief Justice, John Roberts. So the most senior justice on the court is Justice Clarence Thomas. He's on the record of really not liking oral arguments very much. He thinks everything should be done in writing in the parties' briefs. But he did ask a few questions yesterday, which was significant enough, shows how keen he is to get this case decided. But after his question, Justice Sonia Sotomayor really came out swinging against Jim Campbell, the representative of Kayla Childs, her attorney for Alliance Defending Freedom. And I thought he handled that very well. At one point, she peppered him so much that he had to say, I'm trying to answer your question, Justice Sotomayor. Here it is. He handled that very well because Justice Sotomayor's objective was not necessarily adversarial, but she was clearly trying to give Colorado a way out of saying they were going to actually enforce this law. Ms. Stevenson ended up not taking that out, but that's why Justice Sotomayor was so aggressive. What I want to emphasize for our audience, one of the first big points is that our Help Not Harm campaign actually came up right away. So when Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the most junior member of the court, started questioning Jim Campbell, one of her questions was, isn't this just Skrmetti in effect? And what she means is that isn't their argument just another extension of Skrmetti, protecting kids from gender transition procedures? Skrmetti was the case that our side of this issue won last summer, that constitutionalized all 25 state Help Not Harm laws. That was on the physiological aspects of transition. So Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Jackson, made this connection herself, saying, "Isn't this just another aspect of Skrmetti?" And she's right. Skrmetti is so important to this case, and this case is so important to Skrmetti and the Help Not Harm campaign and its effect. And I think even an unbiased observer of the court would have recognized that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was in the dissenting parties for Skrmetti, was still quite upset about how that ruling went, how our side of that issue won. So that was very important. For the record, Justice Brown Jackson still referred to these procedures as "quote unquote" gender affirming care. At this point, I'll just state for the record for our audience, it is impossible to transition genders. All it will do is leave the patients with lifelong medical damage, irreversible damage, usually infertility. They'll be a patient for the rest of their lives. So Jim Campbell did a great job. After that, Shannon Stevenson, the Colorado Solicitor General, came up, and she leaned heavily on two arguments, which is where I'm going to ask you to reflect on some of these as well, Grace. Her first argument, which we'll discuss, is she argued that there is medical consensus about the notion that even talk therapy to help kids struggling with their gender identity and their sexuality come to terms with who they are is actually not helpful but harmful. She thinks that just that basic talk therapy, helping kids get comfortable with their sex, is harmful. And she argued that there is complete medical and scientific consensus on that fact. She cited to that many, many times. Their argument would be affirmation only is the standard of care. Therefore, Colorado can regulate it. She argued that, and then the other cornerstone of her argument is that patients are born this way. We'll cover that in a second. But I just first want to say, Grace, as we know, arguing for Help Not Harm for so many years at FPA, there is no consensus on this. It is quite clear that there is no medical or scientific consensus that affirmation is the only appropriate standard of care. Mrs. Stevenson ended up citing a bunch of studies to support her position. But as Jim Campbell said in his rebuttal, every one of those studies is methodologically flawed. It's based on bias sampling, self-reporting, many other flaws. It's often conducted by transgender activists like a researcher named Jack Turbin, who also filed an amicus brief in this case. This is what FPA has been arguing for years, and it honestly not felt vindicating, but it was a reminder of, we've been at this conversation in different venues other than the court for years at FPA. Grace, you've seen that even in your time with us.
Absolutely. Yes. I think the first thing that popped into my mind, I find it interesting that it's called gender affirming care, because if I was to see that on the surface, I would think that you're actually affirming their natural gender and not trying to push them into another gender. Like, that sounds completely antithetical to me. But I think it's really interesting that oftentimes I see this, that the argument is made that somehow they're in the majority and everyone else is crazy. She's trying to say here that no, there's complete medical consensus on this. This is harmful, just talking to a child. You know, I think that before you make any big life decisions, even, it could just be like, as you're growing up, you want to choose a certain path in school, or maybe you're going to marry someone. It's only natural for people around you who care about you to ask you questions about maybe why you want to do that or how you're feeling about it, because this is a huge decision. So to deny a child any type of counseling and then just be like, okay, make this life altering decision is your only option. And this child is clearly struggling, because to be considering a decision such a dramatic change for their lives, the least we could do is give them some chance to actually ask them, why do you want to do this? What is it that is making you feel uncomfortable in the way you are right now? I guarantee you that for most children, and this is based on my observation of a lot of people who move into this lifestyle, you mentioned Elizabeth Woning, the change movement, they have endless stories like this where there is usually some kind of trauma, some kind of major life event that is pushing this child or this person in a way that they kind of want to escape that identity that they're currently in and push into something else so that they don't have to deal with the pain of something that's happened. And wouldn't it be so much more caring for us to sit down and say, hey, let me actually talk to you about what happened, about what you're feeling, rather than just push them down a one-way path. So I think it's so interesting, that whole idea of gender affirming care to me should say that we should be affirming the gender that they're in right now and help them talk through their thoughts. So it's really interesting. I think we're also seeing some true colors here. I hope that this is a wake-up call to people. But those would be my thoughts on what you just outlined.
That's very good. To wrap up this first coverage of this first argument from Colorado, the Justice Samuel Alito on the court really pressed her on this. Really pressed her on the notion that a standard of care should be the controlling reason why a state can regulate this practice. And he'd cited something that was I found really, really powerful. They did have some comedic exchanges leading up to this. At one point, he said to her, "That's just not what the statute says," and she replied, "This is the way we've interpreted the statute," which later caused him to just be exasperated and say, "That's just not how language works." That's a direct quote I wrote down. But what was very, I think, prescient that I want our audience to hear is that Alito brought up times in the past when medical consensus has been politicized and caught up in radical ideology that was very trendy at the time. And he mentioned a very, very dark aspect of the court's jurisprudence when he did this. The court, unfortunately, has a black mark on its history for when it sanctioned eugenics and forced sterilization in the past. And in fact, Justice Alito, I think to his great credit, regardless of whether you agree with him on this specific question or not, he actually quoted a very infamous statement from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in his opinion deciding the Buck v. Bell case, which is what authorized forced sterilization. And for the record, for audience's awareness, the court has never actually explicitly repealed Buck v. Bell. Now, no one would try to forcefully sterilize anyone anymore. I don't want to alarm our audience, but it is worth noting there's never been a case where the court has explicitly said we are overturning Buck v. Bell. And when Justice Alito quoted from Justice Oliver Wendell, former Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' opinion, this is an infamous line where Justice Holmes wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And Justice Alito's point with that horrifying statement is in that moment when Justice Holmes wrote that, that was what was trendy. That was the medical consensus. And it got Ms. Stevenson to even assent to a hypothetical he brought up where he said, let's say there was a law in the 70s that required mental health counselors to only counsel someone struggling with homosexual feelings to become gay. Or I'm sorry, the law would require someone in that situation to counsel the person dealing with homosexual feelings to try to act straight. She assented that at that time, because that would have been the standard of care, that law would have been constitutional under her argument. If that's not horrifying and tells you the danger of this medical consensus argument, especially when there actually isn't a medical consensus she can definitively point to, is deeply troubling. I do want to just cover the second half of her main argument, because it's also likewise telling. And like you said, Grace, it's even more of a wake-up call. She argued that this is the standard of care because all these feelings these kids are dealing with, that they might be the opposite sex or might be transgender, is actually innate. They are just, quote, born this way, end quote. She didn't use that exact phrase yesterday, but that's the argument we hear from the LGBT lobby oftentimes, is this is an innate characteristic. You are just born that way. As a lawyer, I found that to be maybe an unwise tactic, because in the Skermeti ruling, the court made very clear transgenderism, at least, is not an immutable characteristic. But she really went with this and so the argument would be because it's innate, telling someone they are not what they actually are is harmful. So if a girl thinks she's a boy, you tell her she's a girl because she actually is innately a boy trapped in a girl's body. Telling her she's a girl is harmful. That's the idea. I found this to be very paternalistic. First of all, because there is zero evidence for this either. There's never been found a quote unquote gay gene or any kind of scientific evidence that people are born innately in this. But in Christian theology has always dealt with what we would call disordered desires, or desire to do things that we either shouldn't or don't want to do. And we've always known that this is not immutable as Christians. Like human history, it's long and often tragic story of science catching up to the Bible. But for the state to argue this is incredibly paternalistic. The state is taking your healthcare decision out of your hands, similar to assisted suicide issue, by the way, where the right to die always becomes a duty to die. Every state that has ever established that law, that's what it turns into. The state is forcing you to transition even if you don't want to. They're saying, we know you better than you know you, therefore we're going to force you to do what we think is the right thing. And Stevenson, even one of her quotes I wrote down was, she even told the justices, it's a challenge to find out you're gay. That's where they're coming at this from, and forcing mental health care professionals to be complicit in that is where Kaylee Childs comes in.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. I think it also really limits your sense of identity to just your sexual identity in a way, which I think is really, really sad, that we are seeing a generation where young children are growing up and they're being put into molds where their sense of identity is revolving around their sexuality, when we are so much more than that. And to say that this is also innate, again, you're like trapping this child in this one line of thinking because they had a thought that went through their mind, oh, maybe I'm a boy. And it could be something as simple as, I'm attracted to playing with the boys rather than playing with the girls, or I want to go play soccer, or whatever it is, And, in school, kids say silly things. I remember being like called random things in school, and thankfully, most time you just let it go over your head. But if you start to go into that line of thinking that, like, oh, maybe that thought that just flew through my brain, as do a million other random thoughts every single day, is actually who I am, and now I'm like trapped in this one way of thinking, this one identity, that's really, really concerning, And that's like a natural part of growing up, that you're discovering who you are. And you should be discovering who God has made you to be, especially as Christian parents. That's what one day I would want for my children, is to bring them up and to show them the beauty of who they are in Jesus, because I also know on a personal level that the most amazing freedom and peace in life comes from knowing that.
Mhm.
And so I think that yeah, that's a pretty crazy thing. And I mean, it's a core argument that we see in a lot of this kind of stuff, but I think that it's really dangerous. Especially, it's one thing to be talking about adults, but we're talking about children here. I just want to remind our audience, this is kids we're talking about. And to
Mhm.
me, that takes a whole different side of this, where I'm like, okay, like, we have to stand up and protect children.
Yeah, that's really well said, Grace. So much of the Christian life is just remembering who we are, fearfully and wonderfully made, loved by God, our Creator. He died for us, and He's made us new. So,
Yep.
just a couple final notes on this argument, and then we'll move on to the final part of our show. A couple of our friends, including the great detransitioner and expert on this issue, Aaron Brewer, pointed out to me in a group yesterday that this paternalistic notion from the state that, we know better than you, and this is just who you are. It's dangerous because it tells people struggling with this, particularly kids, as you reminded us, Grace, that there's no hope for you if you have unwanted sexual feelings that you don't want to deal with. You want to get help for them to go away and live, according to your biological sex. They're saying there's no hope for that if that's what you want. And likewise, you follow the logic further, it means there's no hope for people with, real dangerous sexual deviancies like pedophilia. You're telling pedophiles they can't get any help. Um, and That's just the state saying that, of all things, is what should really disturb people. And I came across this one quote from C.S. Lewis yesterday, really randomly, but I think it really applies here, from Mere Christianity. He wrote in Mere Christianity, "Those who are seriously attempting chastity are more conscious and soon know a great deal more about their own sexuality than anyone else. They come to know their desires as Wellington knew Napoleon, as Sherlock Holmes knew Watson or knew Moriarty, as a rat catcher knows rats, or a plumber knows about leaky pipes. Virtue, even attempted virtue, brings light. Indulgence brings fog." And that's the contrast I want people to take away from this. Is this is what one state, actually 22 other states have said, but this is what we know as Christians. So I do want to just wrap up this summary of the oral argument by encouraging our audience. Fortunately, the court did not seem to agree with Ms. Stevenson. They seemed very well swayed that this was indeed a case of viewpoint discrimination against Ms. Childs and all the healthcare professionals who do mental health counseling in Colorado, and hopefully in these other states as well. We've seen, because of Scrimeti, because of the support you, our audience, has given folks like FPA and this whole coalition to get us to a point of Scrimeti, we seem very well positioned to get a good outcome from this case, which is why, Grace, we should probably talk to people about what's next to expect from the court on this case.
Absolutely, I agree. Well, we have, from our side of things, we plan to continue to cover this issue, keep you all updated on this case, as it's super important. And we plan to have Elizabeth back on the podcast and potentially interview some other guests, which I think you mentioned earlier as well, Joseph. So we want to keep this well covered. I think that this is a really important issue, obviously. And I wanted to just say one other thing further to what you were just saying earlier, Joseph. This idea that you're kind of like stuck in one way of life is really anti the gospel, because the whole idea of the gospel is that Jesus came and rescued us from ourselves, from our unwanted desires, unwanted actions, and gave us new life. And so when you start to consider that, like, this is not just a political issue or a gender issue. This is literally a spiritual gospel issue.
That's
And
so
that
well
is
said.
why we have to be involved. So,
Yeah.
Joseph, when should we expect an opinion on this?
So the earliest the court could rule is sometime early next year. It's more likely that
Okay.
it will be toward the end of the court's term. The court's term always ends when the month of June ends. So because this case, could be considered controversial, the court often saves what it thinks to be its controversial rulings for the end. But it's very possible we could hear about this pretty early, around the April timeframe, which is why I'm glad you laid out what we're going to do leading up to that, Grace, on this show and for FPA. We're going to continue to cover this issue. We're going to have folks like Elizabeth back on. We want to have Renee Carlson and Nate Oilo back on to talk about how they felt about not just these oral arguments, but about this issue overall and where we go from here, depending on what the court does. So, and then, of course, when we do get this opinion, we are going to cover it on House to Home and from FPA. Hopefully, we'll be celebrating, but whatever happens, we know God's in control. And so, therefore, we're going to interpret and equip you to talk about it when that time comes. So, with that, but in the meantime, while we wait for it, we do just want to ask our audience, please pray for this case. We pray we would ask you to pray for Kaylee Childs. We ask that you would pray for the Supreme Court justices and their clerks as they conference together and decide how they're going to rule as they write their opinions. Pray that justice would be done for Kaylee and for all mental health counselors all around this country. Their whole profession seems to be at stake in this case. And pray for the children whose access to care is at stake and the parents who have to protect them and watch over them and make the best decisions they can for their health care. Pray for them to have wisdom that they can access the care that they need. This is a justice issue and it's a healing issue. So we just pray you would we just ask that you would join us in prayer for all those parties and for this issue as we wait. And the last thing I'll do is just give a shout out to our great friends at ADF once more. They did such a good job, not just arguing this case, but hosting us allies who are like-minded in this issue and who we mutually support our efforts to protect kids from gender ideology. They've done such a great job. Jim Campbell did an excellent job representing Ms. Childs yesterday. And we're just really thankful to them. We're honored to partner with them and continue to do so till we see this world where kids can get the care they need and mental health care professionals are free to practice their work the way they see fit. So with that, Grace, any final thoughts before we sign off?
I would just say go to our website, familypolicyalliance.com. You can find out more about our Help Not Harm initiative there. You can find out about our other initiatives. This ties in with the Let Parents Parent a little bit too.
Yes.
So please check that out. And we would love to hear from you as well. Write to us and share your thoughts on this and any stories you may even have as a parent. We would love to hear those. So we are fighting for you. Joseph was, as he mentioned, at the Supreme Court. And so, we appreciate everyone watching and all of your support as it enables us to do this. So
amen.
Those would be my final thoughts.
Without you as the audience, we couldn't do this. So thanks, Grace, for your thoughts. One other link for our audience to go to if they want to really dive into this case is go to adflegal.com/Childs, CHILES. We will put that link in the show notes, whether you're watching live or whether you're listening later on Apple Pods or Spotify. And if you like House to Home, if you like this sort of analysis and what we talk about here and how we try to keep you informed, please follow us on YouTube, Apple Pods, Spotify. Hit that follow button. We would love to have your support. And we just thank you for joining us on this really special episode of House to Home, this live show. So whether you're listening now live or later, thank you for joining us. I've been Joseph Combe alongside Grace Youngson. We will be back next week with the next episode of House to Home. See you then.